March of the Machines Aftermath is here, and one of the biggest gimmicks of the new set is the new newly Desparked Planeswalkers that we saw, and Wizards of the Coast has even confirmed in some recent story announcements that we're going to see some other classic Planeswalkers turned into legendary creatures in future sets, and they're not going to confirm whether or not a Planeswalker has lost their spark or not until we see them again, except for a few minor exceptions in the story chapters. So today I'm going to be designing custom Magic the Gathering cards on what I think some of our beloved Planeswalkers would look like as legendary creatures. First is Ajani the Anguished, a 5/7 legendary cat warrior for 4 green and a white with Vigilance and Lifelink, and whenever you gain life, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you can control. Then if you have at least 15 life more than your starting life total, Ajani has Double Strike. Ajani is of course a classic character that has been a part of Magic since Planeswalkers were first introduced back in Rowan, so seeing him as a legendary creature would be super cool. Even though we do know, thanks to the story chapter with Nahiri, that he isn't actually going to be one. For the actual design of his card, 2 major themes that we see in a lot of Ajani's Planeswalker cards is that he often cares about +1/+1 counters and life gain synergies. To represent that on his new legendary card, I decided to combine the two by having it so whenever you gain life, you put a +1/+1 counter on each of your creatures. And to provide additional synergy, I also gave Ajani Lifelink. And his second ability, which checks if you have 15 life greater than your starting life total, is similar to the 0 ability that we see on Ajani, Strength of the Pride, and making it so he gets Double Strike allows you to trigger his first ability 2 separate times. If you wanted to build a deck around Ajani, he works super well with kind of go wide life gain strategies, so cards like Social Climber, Prosperous Innkeeper, and Soul Warden are super cool with him. And then also just a general +1/+1 counter strategy by running stuff like Doubling Season, Foreign Collects, and Hardened Scales. Jiang Yanguu, True Friend, is a 2/2 legendary human shaman for 1 green with, when he enters the battlefield, create Mowu, Loyal Companion, a legendary 0/1 green dog creature token that enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it, and then you can tap him to add 1 green for each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it. Jiang Yanguu is a character we haven't seen that much of, only really appearing in the Global Series decks and the War of the Spark. And while we don't know too much about him, one thing that's been established is that he has a lovable traveling companion, Mowu. So when I made the legendary creature version of him, I had to make it so he creates Mowu when he enters the battlefield. For the rest of the design though, I mainly based it around his War of the Spark card, which, if you don't remember, allows you to put +1/+1 counters on your creature and then have those creatures tap for mana. In this case, I changed it a little bit, now making it so you can tap him for mana equal to the number of creatures you control with +1/+1 counters on them. Kind of a new variation, but also very reminiscent of what he was like in War of the Spark. If you wanted to build around him, of course he's going to work really well with untappers, so stuff like Seedborn Muse, Relic of Legends, and Wilderness Reclamation, and just like Ajani, he's going to work great with +1/+1 counter synergies, so stuff like Foreign Collects, Doubling Season, Hardened Scales, you know the drill. Saheeli, Kaladesh's Architect, is a 4/4 legendary human advisor for 2 blue and a red with blue and tap. Create a 1/1 colorless servo artifact creature token, and servos you control have, when this creature enters the battlefield, you may have it become a copy of target artifact until end of turn. Saheeli is of course an artificer from the plane of Kaladesh, and one thing that is absolutely clear from all of her cards is that she cares about artifacts. Her first ability to tap and create a servo token is a reference to the fact that a majority of her Planeswalker cards have you create a servo or thopter on one of her abilities, and one of the other common things that we see throughout her Planeswalker cards, except for the one printed in Brothers War, is that she can create token copies or turn artifacts into copies of one another. And to tie it in with her first ability on her legendary card, I made it so you can have the servo that you create off of her first ability enter the battlefield as a copy of another artifact you control until the end of turn. So if you wanted to build around her, you could build around having a bunch of super powerful, high mana value artifacts that would benefit a lot from you cloning them. So stuff like Forsaken Monument, Aetherflux Reatherbar, or even some mean creature like Blightsteel Colossus, as long as you give the servo haste in some way. And then what also works well with her are other ways for you to make servos, so cards like Retrofitter Foundry, Master Trinketer, or even Ovia Parshiri. Next is everybody's least favorite planeswalker, Oko. Oko Trap Trickster is a 4/4 legendary elf shapeshifter rogue for 4 green and a blue, and has creatures you control have base power and toughness 3/3, and whenever Oko Trap Trickster deal combat damage to a player, you may have target creature or artifact defending player controls lose all abilities and become a green elk with base power and toughness 3/3. Oko is of course a very infamous planeswalker that we haven't actually seen that much of, considering he's relatively new, having only appeared in the set Throne of Eldraine, but oh boy did he make a massive impact on the game as a whole, being banned in basically everything. Oko has access to shapeshifting magic, and the way that represented this on the original card for him was allowing him to turn things into elks, which in practice ended up being very, very powerful. And to keep in line with this elk gimmick, I decided to give him a very unique passive, essentially giving all of your creatures base power 3/3, so essentially all of your creatures are elks, but not giving the explicit type. Instead, if you wanted to make something into an elk specifically and make it lose all of its abilities, you have to deal damage with him. To call back to the original, allowing you to elk an artifact or creature an opponent controls as long as you deal combat damage to them, still keeping in spirit the trickstery nature of Oko, but not necessarily making it so it's as miserable as his original card. If you wanted to build a deck around Oko, I think one mechanic that would work super well with him is the new Incubate mechanic that we saw from March of the Machines, which are tokens that enter the battlefield with +1/+1 counters on them. So stuff like Glistening Dawn, Glissa, Herald of Predation, and Chrome Host Seed Shark is great because it allows us to incubate, and then with Oko, they're going to be even more powerful than they would be, since the base power and toughness is going to stack with the +1/+1 counters that we get from incubation. And then if we want to be really mean, you can build around his second ability of elking our opponent's stuff, so giving a bunch of evasion with equipment like Shadow Spear, Whisper Silk Quilt, or Trailblazer's Boots would be kind of a fun way to build around him. Speaking of Eldraine, I also made cards around the Kenriths. In the recent story announcement, we actually did get confirmed that these two have lost their spark, and we'll see them in the Wilds of Eldraine set coming out later this year. For my design, I made Will, Scion of Peace, a 3/4 legendary human noble for 1 blue with partner with Rowan, Scion of War, and Vigilance, and whenever you cast an instant or sorcery with mana value 2 or greater that would draw any number of cards, draw an additional card. And Rowan, Scion of War is a 4/3 legendary human noble for 1 red and has haste, and whenever you cast an instant or sorcery with mana value 2 or greater that deals damage to one target, Rowan deals an additional 2 damage to that target. The last time that we saw Rowan and Will was back in Strixhaven, where they learned a bunch of powerful spells from all across the multiverse. And to reinforce this fact, in my designs for them as legendary creatures, I decided to make both of them care about instants and sorceries, but to be reflective of their personalities, I made it so Will cares about you drawing cards, and Rowan cares about dealing damage, which seems pretty consistent with their personalities and how they generally approach things. And I also decided to reference and emphasize the fact that they are twins by having their cards be somewhat parallel of each other, with them both caring about instants and sorceries with a mana value specifically being 2 or greater, and both of them having the same power and toughness, but just flipped, with Rowan having a higher attack and Will having a higher toughness. If you wanted to build around these two, I think probably the most important thing would be building around that partner synergy, so having stuff like Commander's Insight, Bloodstorm Suit, or Echo Storm would be great, and then also of course we want to build around their actual abilities of dealing damage and drawing cards with instants and sorceries that have a mana value of 3 or greater. So stuff like Into the Fire, Invoke the Firemind, and Prismari command would be super great with them. Next is Huatli, Ixalan's Savior, a 2/2 legendary human warrior for red, green, or white. With Huatli, Ixalan's Savior gets +1/+1 for each dinosaur you control. And whenever a non-token dinosaur creature enters the battlefield under your control, if its mana value is greater than any other dinosaur you control, draw a card for each dinosaur you control. Huatli is a pretty cool character, being the warrior poet of Ixalan, meaning she has a very close connection with a lot of the powerful dinosaurs of the plane. As we see in cards like Huatli Dinosaur Knight and Huatli Warrior Poet, she really does care about dinosaurs in a lot of her designs. So when designing the legendary creature for her, I decided to lean hard into this dinosaur tribal synergy. However, one thing I did want to make a little bit different for her when compared to other dinosaur tribal cards is I think that a lot of dinosaur tribal cards do want you to go tall with stuff like Gishath or Zakama, but I think what's interesting about this design for Huatli is that it encourages you to go wide, considering her first ability wants you to have a lot of dinosaurs on the battlefield for her to get a bunch of boost in her power and toughness, and then her second ability is very peculiar, having you care about the mana value of your dinosaurs. Essentially, it encourages you to have this direct ramp of mana values for your dinosaurs. So it wants you to play dinosaurs that are not only 1-drops, but 2-drops, 3-drops, and all across your mana curve, and encouraging you to get some use out of your mid to lower mana value dinosaurs that we don't really see as often. I think this is going to be a really cool commander to build around, and encourages you to be very thoughtful about your sequencing and how you actually play the deck. If you wanted to build around her, of course she's going to work great with dinosaurs like Wayward, Swordtooth, Ripjaw Raptor, and Regisaur Alpha. Specifically, dinosaurs like Regisaur Alpha are great because they can make dinosaur tokens, making it so you have even more dinosaurs that you can draw cards off of or boost Huatli's power with. And then another cool strategy you can employ with Huatli is bouncing your dinosaurs to your hand and trying to get some more use out of them. So bouncing a higher mana value dinosaur and then replaying them is going to let you draw a ton of cards. So stuff like White Mane Lion, Core Sky Fisher, and Teamer Sabertooth work amazing with her. Next is one of my personal favorite planeswalkers, Angrath Trapped Again, a 6/6 legendary creature Minotaur Pirate Rogue for 4 black and a red, and it has Menace. When Angrath enters the battlefield or attacks, gain control of target artifact or creature until the end of turn. Untap it, it gains haste. And then you can pay red and tap him to sacrifice an artifact you control, then create tapped treasure tokens equal to the mana value of the sacrificed artifact, and you can only activate it once each turn. Angrath is one of my favorite planeswalkers, and one thing that's really funny about his story is that he essentially already lost his spark before, getting stuck on Ixalan thanks to the Immortal Sun. And now he's stuck again thanks to losing his spark. For his actual design, one of Angrath's super cool abilities is his Magical Change, which allows him to steal artifacts and bind other creatures super easily. And we see this in cards like Hijacker Angrath the Flame Chain, allowing us to steal creatures and artifacts from our opponents. To represent this on his legendary card, I made it so we essentially hijack our opponents whenever we enter the battlefield or attack. For his second ability, I mainly built it around his lore. Essentially, Angrath's MO is to planeswalk across the multiverse, steal powerful artifacts, and then sell them off to whatever buyer will take them, and then use that money to support his family. To represent this on a legendary creature card, I made it so we can sacrifice an artifact to create treasure tokens. Essentially the idea that we're selling the artifact for money. And because it synergizes great with his first ability where we can steal artifacts from our opponents, it is an awesome synergy where we're essentially taking our opponent's very powerful artifacts and using it for our own gain. If you wanted to build around him, I think one thing that you do have to build around is because our opponents aren't always going to have artifacts, we do need to run a bunch of other sack outlets so that we can get some use out of our opponent's creatures. So stuff like Fling, Ashnod's Altar, and Viscera would work great. And the other place to lean into is maybe sacrificing a few of our own artifacts and leaning more into a treasure-esque strategy for running stuff like Marionette Master, Academy Manufacturer, and Goldspan Dragon. Then we have Garruk Primal Hunter, a 5/4 legendary human ranger for 3 green and has non-human creatures you control get +1/+1, and whenever a non-token creature you control attacks, you may untap a basic land you control. Garruk is another one of the first set of 5 planeswalkers that we saw back in Lorwyn, and one thing that has been critical to his lore has been the fact that he has a lot greater connection to animals and beasts rather than people. And in game, this is often represented by caring about non-human synergies, as seen in cards like Return of the Wild Speaker. For his legendary creature card, I decided to give him an anthem for non-human creatures to emphasize this. Additionally, I made it so whenever a non-human creature you control attacks, you untap a basic land as a fun callback to his original Lorwyn card, which allows you to untap up to 2 lands. If you wanted to build around him, he's of course going to work very well with non-human tribal synergies, so stuff like Invasion of Ikoria, Keeper of Fables, and Grumgully the Generous would work great with him. And also, to take advantage of that second ability that allows you to untap lands, you could use things that double or triple your mana, so stuff like Nissa Who Shakes the World, Zendikar Resurgence, or Nyxboom Ancient would go great with him. And then finally, I think probably out of all the cards I've made today, this is the one I actually want to see the most. We have Jace, Phyrexia's New Hope, a 5/5 legendary Phyrexian human wizard for 3 blue, hybrid Phyrexian Dimir, and black, which has, whenever you lose life for the first time each turn, you may pay a Phyrexian blue, and if you do, you may draw cards equal to the amount of life lost that way, and Phyrexians you control have tapped. Each player loses 2 life and mills 2 cards. Jace was notably and kind of strangely very absent from the March of the Machines story, despite being one of the 5 planeswalkers that we lost back in Phyrexia All Will Be One. And considering we generally know the outcome of everybody else except for kind of Vraska, it's kind of weird that Magic the Gathering's biggest character didn't really get mentioned too much. So what I think, and what my hope, is that when Phyrexia inevitably comes back in some way, Jace will be their new leader. Now that all of the Praetors have fallen, there's no real leader of Phyrexia, and if I think anybody could do it, I think it would be Jace. For the actual design of his card, I wanted to emphasize this new Phyrexian version of him, so I designed him around losing life, which happens as a result of Phyrexian mana. But to keep it in line with Jace himself, I decided to make the payoff for this loss of life drawing cards. And to reinforce the idea that he's Phyrexia's new leader, I also made it so he creates an anthem for all your Phyrexians. I'm making each player mill 2 cards and lose 2 life, which of course calls back to Jace, the Perfected Mind, by milling 2 cards, but also enables his first ability by making it so you're losing 2 life no matter what. If you wanted to build around him, he's going to work really well with big life loss effects, so stuff like Peer into the Abyss, Stinging Study, or Bolas' Citadel would work great with him, but you're also probably going to want to run a few other payoffs that benefit from you losing life. Big top end threats like Villus Broker or Blood would be great with him, allowing you to draw almost your whole deck, and then cool other life loss carrying cards, so stuff like Shadow of Mortality or Death Shadow would be kind of fun to build around him with. And then also you could lean a little bit more into the second ability, doing the Phyrexian Tribal, or leaning into the mill strategy by running stuff like the Scarab God, Bruvak, or hey, maybe even Jace the Perfected Mind. If you want to check out more of my stuff, you should check out this video over here where I redesigned a bunch of commanders to make them a little bit more fair.